March 15, 2024, West Loop neighborhood, Chicago, Illinois. A postal worker named David Chen was supervising the demolition of Building 433, an old mail processing facility built in 1952, scheduled to be torn down to make room for luxury apartments. The building had been closed since 2018, empty for 6 years, a relic of a time when letters mattered, when the post office was the thread connecting millions of American lives. David was doing a final walkthrough, making sure nothing valuable was left behind. Equipment had been removed, files had been transferred, the building was supposed to be empty. But in the basement, behind a brick wall that maintenance workers were preparing to demolish, David noticed something. A gap, a space that shouldn't exist. Behind the bricks, there was a room. The demolition crew broke through. Inside, they found an old mail sorting station, frozen in time. Equipment from the 1970s, dust covering everything. And wedged behind one of the sorting racks, hidden for over 50 years, 63 letters, all addressed to the same person, Margaret Walsh, 1247 Beacon Street, Boston, Massachusetts, 02215. All sent from the same sender, Robert Hayes, APO, San Francisco 96243. Military address, Vietnam. The envelopes were yellowed, the stamps were from 1971, the postmarks ranged from February through December. 63 letters, written by a soldier to his girl back home, paid for, stamped, ready to be delivered, and somehow they'd gotten stuck behind a mail sorting rock in a basement in Chicago for 53 years. David Chen opened the first letter. It was dated February 14th, 1971, Valentine's Day. It began, "My dearest Margaret, Happy Valentine's Day, my love. I'm sitting in the barracks thinking about last Valentine's Day when we danced at the Knights of Columbus Hall and you wore that red dress. I close my eyes and I can still see you smiling at me. The guys here are playing cards and talking about home. All I can think about is you, about the life we're going to have when I get back, about the house on Beacon Street we talked about our children, about growing old together. I count the days, Margaret, every single one. All my love, Bobby." David Chen sat on a dusty floor in an abandoned post office and cried because he knew these letters never arrived. Margaret Walsh never got her Valentine, never got any of these letters, never knew that Robert Hayes was writing to her every week, pouring his heart onto paper, counting the days until he could come home to her. For 53 years, these letters had been waiting, and David Chen had one question. What happened to Robert Hayes and Margaret Walsh? What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the promises we keep to each other. This is the true story of two people separated by war, connected by letters that never arrived, and reunited by fate 53 years later. This is the story of the love letter that took 53 years to arrive. Before we continue with this remarkable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We share true stories that prove some things are worth waiting for. To understand these letters, you have to understand where they came from. South Boston, Massachusetts, 1965. Robert Hayes was 17 years old, Irish Catholic family. Father worked at the docks. Mother raised 6 kids in a 3-bedroom apartment. Bobby was the oldest. Margaret Walsh was 16, lived 4 blocks away. Her father drove a bus. Her mother cleaned houses. She was the youngest of 5 daughters. They met at a church dance, St. Augustine's Parish Hall, September 1965. Bobby asked her to dance. She said yes. He was shy, awkward, stepped on her toes twice. She laughed and told him it was okay. She thought he was sweet. They dated all through high school, movies on Saturday nights, ice skating at the Common in winter, walking along the harbor in summer. It was the kind of love that made sense in neighborhoods like South Boston. You met someone from your neighborhood, you dated, you got married, you stayed. That was the plan. Robert graduated in 1966, started working at the docks with his father, saved money. Margaret graduated in 1967, got a job as a secretary at an insurance company, saved money. They were going to get married. Everyone knew it. Their families knew it. The whole neighborhood knew it. Robert bought a ring in November 1969, a simple gold band with a small diamond. Cost him 3 months' wages. He proposed on Christmas Eve in front of the nativity scene at St. Augustine's. She said yes before he finished asking. They set the date, June 20th, 1970. And then, in February 1970, Robert got his draft notice. Vietnam. Robert Hayes had been drafted. He reported to basic training in March 1970. The wedding was postponed. Not canceled, postponed. When I get back, Robert promised. The day I get back, we'll get married, I promise. Margaret wore his ring on a chain around her neck, waited, wrote letters every single day. Robert completed basic training, advanced infantry training, and in September 1970, at age 22, Private Robert Hayes boarded a plane to Vietnam. The last thing he said to Margaret at the airport was, "Wait for me. I'll write you every week, and when I come home, we'll get married, I promise." Robert arrived in Vietnam in late September 1970. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, based near Da Nang. He kept his promise. He wrote to Margaret every week, sometimes more. The letters detailed his days, the weather, the food, the guys in his unit, how much he missed her, how he counted the days until his rotation ended. Margaret received every letter. She wrote back immediately, every single one. She told him about her job, about his family, about Boston, about the apartment she was looking at for them, about wedding plans she was making, about how much she loved him. For 6 months, the letters flowed. Robert kept them in a waterproof bag, read them over and over. They were his lifeline. And then, in February 1971, something changed. Robert was sent on an extended operation, deep into enemy territory. His unit was going to be in the field for weeks. No mail delivery, no way to send letters. Before he left, he wrote 13 letters, one for each week he'd be gone. He gave them all to the mail clerk, dated them, asked him to send one each week. "So she knows I'm thinking about her, so she doesn't worry," Robert explained. The mail clerk promised he'd send one each week. Robert went into the jungle. The mail clerk handed the 13 letters to the postal system. They entered the Military Postal Network, APO San Francisco, the routing center for Vietnam mail. They were sorted, processed, loaded onto planes, flown across the Pacific. And then, somewhere in the system, something went wrong. The letters arrived at Building 433 in Chicago, a massive processing facility. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of mail passed through every day. Robert's letters went into a sorting rock, and somehow they slipped, fell behind the rock, got wedged in a gap. The machinery kept running. The supervisors never noticed. The letters were simply forgotten. They never made it to Boston, never reached Margaret Walsh, never arrived. Before we continue, I want to know if you've ever sent something important that never arrived. A letter, a package, something that mattered. Drop your story in the comments. And if you're as moved by this story as I was researching it, hit that like button and share this with someone who remembers when letters were how we stayed connected. Because what happened next changed 2 lives forever. February 14th, 1971. Valentine's Day. Margaret Walsh checked the mail. Nothing from Bobby. February 21st. Still nothing. February 28th. Nothing. She tried not to worry. Mail from Vietnam was unpredictable. Sometimes letters took weeks, sometimes they came in bunches. But by mid-March, she'd gone 6 weeks without a letter, the longest silence since he'd deployed. She wrote to him, "Bobby, I haven't heard from you. Are you okay? Please write. I'm worried." She heard nothing. March became April. April became May. 2 months, 3 months, no letters. Margaret went to the recruitment office, asked if they had information on Private Robert Hayes. They said he was listed as active duty, no casualties reported. He was alive, but he wasn't writing. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Robert Hayes was wondering the same thing. He'd returned from the field in late March 1971, went straight to mail call, expected a stack of letters from Margaret. There was nothing. He thought maybe they were delayed. He wrote to her immediately. "Margaret, I just got back. Did you get my letters? I wrote you 13, one for each week I was gone. Please write back. I miss you." He waited. A week passed, 2 weeks, no response. He wrote again. "Margaret, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Please write to me." Still nothing. By May 1971, Robert Hayes believed that Margaret Walsh had stopped writing to him, and Margaret Walsh believed that Robert Hayes had stopped writing to her. Both were wrong, but neither knew it. In June 1971, Robert's mother wrote to him. She'd seen Margaret at church. Margaret had asked if Robert was okay, if he was angry with her, if she'd done something wrong. "She still loves you, Bobby," his mother wrote, "but she thinks you don't want to marry her anymore. She thinks you've changed your mind." Robert's heart broke. He wrote a 20-page letter explaining everything: the mission, the 13 letters he'd sent, how much he loved her, how he'd never stopped loving her. He sent it priority mail, marked it urgent. It arrived. It was the first letter Margaret had received in 4 months. She read it and cried for hours. She wrote back immediately. "Bobby, I never got those 13 letters, but I don't care. I'm just so happy to hear from you. I thought you'd forgotten me. I thought you didn't love me anymore. I love you. I'll wait forever if I have to." The letters started flowing again. Every week. Both directions. Neither mentioned the missing letters again. They chalked it up to the chaos of war, the unreliability of military mail. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that 13 letters were sitting in a sorting facility in Chicago, gathering dust, forgotten, waiting. Robert Hayes completed his tour in August 1972, after 2 years in Vietnam. He came home. Margaret was waiting at Logan Airport, wearing the same red dress from Valentine's Day 1969. When he saw her, he dropped his duffel bag and ran. They got married 3 weeks later. St. Augustine's Church, small ceremony, 50 people. Margaret wore a simple white dress. Robert wore his dress uniform. They moved into an apartment on Beacon Street, the one Margaret had been looking at 2 years earlier, the one they'd talked about in letters. Robert got a job at the post office. The irony wasn't lost on him. He delivered mail, trusted the system to get mail where it needed to go. Never knew that 13 of his own letters had never arrived. Margaret got pregnant in 1973. They had a daughter, Anne, then a son, Michael, then another daughter, Catherine. They saved money, bought a house in Dorchester in 1978, raised their kids. Robert worked his way up to postal supervisor. Margaret taught at the parish school. They had a good life, a full life, married for 49 years. They never forgot those missing letters. Occasionally, over the years, they'd mention them. "Whatever happened to those 13 letters?" Margaret would ask. "Lost in the system somewhere," Robert would say. "Probably ended up in the dead letter office." "I wonder what you wrote," Margaret would say. "I told you I loved you," Robert would respond. "Same thing I tell you every day." And that was enough. Robert Hayes died in June 2021 at the age of 73. Heart attack. Margaret buried him at Cedar Grove Cemetery, surrounded by their children, their 7 grandchildren. She kept his letters, the ones that arrived, the ones before and after the missing 13. Boxes of them. 50 years of love, written on paper. But she always wondered about those 13 letters. what they said, where they'd gone. She never thought she'd find out. March 15, 2024. David Chen held 63 letters, 53 years old, never delivered. He knew he should turn them over to the Postal Service, log them as recovered mail, send them through proper channels. But something made him hesitate. These weren't just letters. These were someone's life, someone's love, someone's hope. He took them home. That night, he searched. Margaret Walsh, Boston, Massachusetts. It took 3 hours. Social media, public records, phone directories. And then he found her. Margaret Hayes, born Margaret Walsh, 75 years old, widow, still living in Dorchester. He found her phone number. His hands shook as he dialed. "Mrs. Hayes?" he said. "Yes?" "My name is David Chen. I'm a postal worker in Chicago. I found something. Letters addressed to you from 1971, from someone named Robert Hayes." Silence. "Mrs. Hayes, are you there?" "Bobby sent letters in 1971, 13 of them. I never got them. We thought they were lost. He died 3 years ago." "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you I found them, all 13. Would you like me to send them to you?" Margaret Hayes cried. "Yes," she said. "Please, yes." David Chen didn't mail the letters. He flew to Boston, on his own time, at his own expense. He hand-delivered them to Margaret Hayes. She opened the door, white-haired, 75 years old. He handed her a package. 53 years late, he said. "I'm sorry." Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, and read her husband's letters he wrote to her half a century ago. Letters about missing her, about the life they'd build together, about the children they'd have, about growing old with her. Everything he'd written had come true. The house on Beacon Street, they lived there. The children, Anne, Michael, and Catherine, were all mentioned by name, though he couldn't have known them yet. Growing old together, they had. "It's like he could see the future," she told her daughter. "No," her daughter said. "He just loved you enough to make it real." Margaret cried, but they were good tears, the kind that come when you realize love never really ends. It just keeps finding ways to reach you, even 53 years later. David Chen stayed for dinner. The family treated him like a hero. Before he left, Margaret hugged him. "You didn't deliver mail. You delivered my husband's last gift to me. Thank you." The 13 letters sit now in a frame above her fireplace, next to Robert's photo, next to their wedding picture. A reminder that love survives distance, survives time, survives even death. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it comes back to you when you need it most. This is the true story of Robert and Margaret Hayes and 13 love letters that waited 53 years to come home. The United States Postal Service processes 146 billion pieces of mail every year. 99.9% arrive exactly where they're supposed to, but 0.1% don't. They get lost, delayed, forgotten. Most are junk mail, bills, advertisements, but some are love letters from soldiers who won't make it home, birthday cards from grandparents who will be gone before they arrive, final words from people who need to be heard. These letters matter, not because of what they're written on, but because of what they represent: connection, hope, love, the belief that our words can reach across distance and time to touch the people we care about. Robert Hayes believed that when he wrote those 13 letters in 1971. They finally reached Margaret in 2024, 53 years late, but exactly on time. Because sometimes The universe knows when we need to hear "I love you" most. I want to hear from you. Do you still have love letters? From a spouse, a parent, a grandparent? Have you ever sent a letter that never arrived, or received one years after it was sent? Share your stories in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've lost or someone you still love, hit that like button and share this with them. Because in a world of texts and emails that disappear, there's something powerful about words written on paper, words that last, words that wait, words that find their way home. Subscribe for more true stories that prove love is stronger than time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And if you have letters, read them. You never know when they might be exactly what you need to hear.